Without further ado, I'll kick off my session on building an international career. My name's Bea. I'm currently in Dublin, Ireland right now. You can see my Irish sheep. But I'm originally from a small upper-class town in Massachusetts. I'm in Dublin visiting my employer Datadog's Dublin office, and where I work as a detection engineer, but normally in the Paris, France office. And I'm also a co-lead of Datadog's Veterans Community Guild. In addition, I have a side job as a civil affairs officer. My U.S. Army Reserve unit is in Germany. Okay, so let me check the chat real quick. So a little bit about my career. I joined the Massachusetts Army National Guard in fall 2013 following the Boston Marathon bombings. I was simultaneously part of ROTC, and I commissioned as an active duty cyber officer in 2017. I had spent my entire 3-year Army career in Fort Gordon, Georgia. When I joined the Guard nearly 10 years ago, I had no idea that I was going to be active duty soon, in 3 years from there. And I had no idea that after active duty, I would move overseas. And when I moved overseas to Germany 2 years ago, I had no idea that I would soon be living in Paris, France. So what I'm telling you now, to determine what to tell you now, I think about what I would tell my past self. And that's why I hope it will be useful to you as well. Now I'll go back to the screen to check chat. Okay, so what we will cover today, first I've introduced myself, and there's also a chance for you to introduce yourself in chat. We'll talk about considerations if you're in the military and transitioning. We'll talk about public sector opportunities, private sector opportunities overseas, considerations if you want to be a reservist, the managing the emotional side of moving overseas and planning your overseas move. So I've introduced myself, and now is a chance for you to introduce yourself in chat if you'd like. You can tell us if you're a veteran, if you're a family member or an ally. You can say if you're U.S. military or non-U.S. military, whether you've transitioned out of the military already or you're transitioning currently. You can say whether you're a Guard or reservist and whether you're U.S. based or overseas in chat. Salut, another French speaker. Great, we have Lester from Singapore, and he's currently in Toronto, Canada. I was actually born in Canada. I've been around the world. Yeah, great. Jaren, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Yeah, so transition out of the military, but looking to transition into InfoSec, and that is a transition. Hannah Kingston's in the Nigerian Army. Some U.S. Tom retired from the U.S. Navy, currently working in the private sector like me and looking for opportunities in South Korea. Yeah, thank you all for all that have introduced yourselves. I will check chat periodically Thank you, Aaron. Also, active duty Marine might transition at some point and might join the reserve. Okay. Yeah. Have any of you had a chance to work overseas? It seems Lester's working overseas currently in Canada. Anyone else working overseas or had a chance at some point to work overseas in their military career or civilian career? That's all right. So I think some people in the U.S. military especially have probably had a chance to be stationed overseas. And the military overseas experience is really a formative experience for those who have it. I have not had the chance, I did not have the chance to be stationed overseas in the military while I was on active duty, but I know many people who did, and it's a formative experience for many people because it could be the first time you've been overseas, or maybe even the first time out of state if you grew up in a small town like me. And it's a good experience, good first overseas experience, because you get assistance in moving. You get base privileges like a convenience store on base, probably share selling your favorite American goods or other goods that give you a taste of home. In the military, when you go overseas, you can visit parts of the world that are rarely visited. Sometimes it's because it's a war zone and people don't want to visit that place, but you get to visit, and many people make new friends. Some even meet their significant other overseas. But the military experience overseas is a bit limited because you are stuck on base, or at least spend most of your time on base. You may be forced to live in base housing. Usually people don't integrate so much into the host country, and it's really not the typical expatriate or immigrant experience. Additionally, the overseas experience for military is temporary, but I think the impact of moving overseas in the military is lifelong, and it will stay with you. Now checking chat. Wow, Hannah's grandfather served overseas in London under the army. Yeah, there's quite a few veterans who have spent time overseas. That's really great. Now, considerations for transitioning military, since there are people who are in the military currently and will transition. In the US military specifically, there are a few transition programs that do play a key role in making sure that veterans, people who have separated from the military, can find a job and reintegrate into civilian society. So they're useful, but they have a limited usefulness. They present a standardized curriculum. Even if you're overseas, apparently the transition programs will present the perspective that you will go back to the US and work in the US. But despite all their shortcomings, transitioning assistance programs are a good opportunity to network and meet people, meet your classmates and community members who could be a better resource than the curriculum. in addition, when you're transitioning, you can get resources with organizations like VetSec hosting this conference and Veterati, which is a mentoring service. You go on their website and you can book calls with military veterans and family members who have offered their time to help veterans transition. And these veterans and military family members on Veterati are mostly in the US, but all over the world and working in different industries. As a civil affairs reservist, I was even able to find other civil affairs reservists on Veterati. Now, most of the things I present here will have a US perspective, but I hope these can transfer over to people who are not in the US, were in the US military. In general, there are opportunities in the public sector. Every country has embassies, and in the US Department of Defense, other US federal departments, there are opportunities to work overseas. Someone in the previous keynote asked what's the quickest way to 150K. The answer might be here, because in the public sector, you tend to get higher salaries compared to locals, and you get relocation assistance if you have been in the US military overseas. You've got relocation assistance to move overseas, and the public sector opportunities will offer you similar relocation assistance. You get tax benefits. I spent 2 years working for a government contractor in Germany that does defense projects for the US Department of Defense, and we didn't have to pay German taxes, as well as getting the standard US tax exemption where your first 110K or so of income each year is tax exempt. So the vast majority of my income was tax exempt, and I was effectively living like I had a salary of 150K or so. Like in the military, if you work in the public sector, you kind of get privileges, base privileges, or embassy privileges. So these can help out. But drawbacks of the public sector are a limited choice of employers. You may have to do time in your home country. If you work in a federal department, they may expect you to work a few years in the US, and possibly not exactly the best places in the US before you get the overseas jobs that everyone wants. And again, these are temporary and limited, especially if you are working in sensitive government work. You may have travel restrictions, so you may not be able to fully take advantage of all the travel opportunities around you. Jaron mentioned that John, the keynote speaker, was a civil affairs officer. I think it's mostly a coincidence, but civil affairs, along with other roles in the military, do carry over well to the civilian world, because when overseas and also in the US, it's about interactions with the local populace. Speaking about interacting with locals, I will now talk about private sector opportunities overseas. So these are opportunities to be employed by people who are hiring in your host country, companies that are originated from the country you're looking to move to, or international companies. I work in the private sector currently. I changed to the private sector this year after spending time in the government contracting space, and I do enjoy it, because in the private sector you have more choice of employers. There are only so many government departments and only so many companies doing projects for them overseas, but there are a lot of companies and on the economy. You get more freedom to travel, and the work culture will be different. Sorry, interrupted by an announcement. And the work culture will be different. It could be better, or you could be working harder, but I think it usually tends to be a better work culture in the private sector. However, your job search could be more difficult because you are competing against people who are native to the country and already speak the language. The company may need to sponsor your work permit. That is, unless you can find a way to get citizenship, and many countries do offer citizenship to people based if you have parents from that country, if you have maybe even if you have ancestors who originated from their country or a spouse from that country. As well, there are partner agreements between countries which can make it easier for you to move to certain countries and get a work permit in certain countries if your country has an agreement with their country. For instance, many former French colonies have some sort of arrangements with France. Many former British colonies have arrangements with Britain, and so forth. That covers private sector opportunities. And then another question is, do you need to work, especially U.S. military folks? You may be getting retirement. You may be getting disability payments. You may have a lot of savings, and you may be moving to a country that has a lower cost of living. Like if you're from a country like the U.S. or Canada, most of the 150 plus countries in the world are cheaper than the country you're in currently. And there are cost of living calculators out there like Numbeo that let you compare the city you live in to a city you are thinking of moving in. For instance, I'm shown on this slide comparison between San Diego, California, and Berlin. I've lived in Berlin before, and I visited San Diego before. And in general, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, you could probably subsist well in Berlin if you're making half the salary that you would make in San Diego. It says the average net salary of someone in Berlin is about 36,000 US dollars a year. So yeah, the average person in Berlin is probably doing fine with that amount of money. And if you change your lifestyle to do what the locals do instead of what your home country do, you could get by even more. For instance, in Europe, it's less common for people to own cars and instead rely on public transportation. If you are willing to forgo a car and deal with public transportation networks, you could stretch your savings more. Chat. Okay. There are some people thinking about reservist opportunities, so I can speak about what I found out about being in the reserves as a reservist in a U.S. Army unit in Germany. So opportunities to work towards your military retirement. You can do that by finding a unit that is overseas and going to drill monthly or quarterly. There was a unit in Germany. It was convenient to go to drill and train 1 weekend a month while I was in Germany. Now I live in Paris and I still train once a month, and it's 350 miles each way, but the trains are really fast and I get there in under 6 hours. Of course, sometimes you can get away with not going every month, but once a quarter. You could even find a unit that's as a U.S. military person, you could even find a unit that's back in the U.S. and perhaps they'll let you train virtually and only go in person quarterly or annually. You can be part of the IMA, the Individual Military Augmentee Program, attached to certain joint units. They usually do their training in 1 month of the year. You could get full-time active guard reserve jobs overseas or go on orders overseas. So there are many different ways to be in the reserves overseas if you want to. And the question is, do you want to? There are fewer units overseas. They will take time your training does take time, and it happens that my reserve training, it's only once a month, but always seems to be the weekend before an exam in my degree program or the weekend before a big project is due at work. So bear with it. If you're working in the private sector for a local company, you don't necessarily get employment rights. So I am using my vacation days for going to drill. Thankfully, in France, we get a ton of vacation days. And these overseas units do have high turnover because many military family members will join reserve units overseas. They're here on temporary assignments and they may go back in 3 years. On the flip side, you meet very unique and talented individuals. You can do training with units from all different nations. For instance, I recently did the Nijmegen Foot March in Netherlands, which featured people from over 20 countries like Canada, Singapore, UK. And then overseas, you are close to active combat theaters. There are lots of things going on and lots of investment here. Newer mention got to figure in the overall tax rate for your paycheck in Europe, and my buddy Pierre is on point. It's about 25%. My take-home pay overseas has been pretty high. Sometimes it seems I take even a higher percentage home than I did in the US, but it really varies based on where you are and how much you are making. Also consider that if you're an American citizen, you have to file US taxes everywhere, but you do not necessarily have to pay US taxes if you're making less than 110,000 US dollars a year, and that's after exempting your housing too. Okay, so emotions management. Going overseas is big. It could be hard to get overseas. The job search could take a while, and you might have to make hard decisions like turning down good paying domestic jobs in hopes of pursuing your ultimate dream of going overseas. And international relocation is not easy either. Culture shock is a phenomenon that does not actually hit immediately, because when some people go overseas, the first feeling is fascination with a new culture. It's only after a few months that you experience culture shock. But when culture shock hits, it can take a while to get over it, even a year or 2 years, with feeling anxious, frustrated. But you will adapt in your own time, in your own way. And culture does differ from language. For instance, the French language is spoken in France, it's spoken in Belgium, it's spoken in a lot of Africa, Luxembourg, Switzerland, but each of these countries have a different culture. And the best way to learn the culture, possibly the only way to live the culture, is to be immersed in it and get over that culture shock. So what might an overseas transition look like? Whether you're transitioning out of the military and going immediately overseas, or you've been out of the military and want to go overseas in the next few years, or maybe even longer out. Well, I can tell you about my transition experience since I transitioned out of the military 2 years ago and moved overseas. Well, I wasn't planning on leaving the military, leaving active duty U.S. Army after only 3 years. I wasn't planning until about 8 months from the end of my contract. I thought I would stay in until I made captain, but I was in therapy and took advantage of the military one-source therapist free sessions that challenged my assumptions and working with my therapist to build good habits. So my assumption that I would stay in the active U.S. Army 4 years, I realized I didn't have to do it and changed my timeline to being 3 years. When I made that decision, I was 8 months out from the end of my contract. I had to put in a packet called a resignation from active duty or a refrat, and I even needed an exception to policy because the U.S. Army thinks 9 months from the end of their contract is too soon of a notice for them. Most civilian employers only want you to give 2 months notice, but the U.S. Army wants lots of notice if you're leaving them. And that's a challenging situation for some people because it's basically impossible to get a job 9 months out. Most employers don't make offers until about 1 month out. I was lucky in my transition to be part of VetSec, to have just joined that, and someone in VetSec posted a job overseas. I will always be grateful to my buddy in VetSec who posted a job listing, and I interviewed for that job. There was a possibility to interview remotely for the job in Germany, but I happened to be on a temporary duty assignment, a business trip in Germany, and was able to make it to the interview in person. The next week, COVID hit, and I had to leave the country in a rush. So I was transitioning as the world was dealing with COVID, which was stressful, but thankfully, the U.S. Army lets you take all your leave days, all your saved up vacation days before you have to go into the civilian world. While on terminal leave, I tried to request overseas leave, but people in my base in Georgia did not comprehend that your terminal leave can be overseas. So I just put down that I was going to my mother's house after I left the Army because they wouldn't let me put overseas. I put in dozens of job applications, had a couple of interviews, but what mattered in the end is that there was one offer to work for the company that a buddy in VetSec referred me to. I sold my big furnitures and shipped out 25 boxes to an army post office in Germany because it was quicker than waiting for a moving company during the beginning of COVID. And I moved over shortly after Germany reopened their country. I also found my reserve unit while I was in Germany and got my orders changed a week before the end of my terminal leave. And on the very last day of terminal leave, I got a call from my active duty unit. They asked me why I was in Germany without authorization. And I explained that I had tried to request terminal leave to go to Germany, but it was beyond the base's comprehension that terminal leave can be overseas. Thankfully, my boss in active duty was pretty cool. He just wanted me to sign a piece of paper that I had already signed. And that was my last interaction with the active duty Army while on active duty. So some takeaways from that. Some takeaways from that are that there are opportunities overseas in the public sector as well as the private sector. Military transition programs will get you started, but it's up to you to find your network and get yourself where you want to go. And that does require some hard decisions. And you can find, if you want to be a reservist overseas and work towards your U.S. military retirement, there's options there as well. But if you don't want to work, that could be possible depending on what country you move to. And there are emotions involved in moving overseas. There are hard decisions, and you will move away from what you're familiar with to probably a less familiar place. That's up to you to manage, but rely definitely on your network, and hopefully you find a supportive network that will support you in whatever you do. Lots of you have ancestors that at some point made a trip into the unknown. So if you're thinking about moving overseas, give it a go. You might just like it. This concludes my talk. Do you have any questions? And shout out to my #1 fan, JJ. Yep, he's my #1 fan. Yep, Pierre. Okay, I guess Pierre can get #2 spot. All right, I'll just let Pierre and JJ face off for fan spots. Or maybe I'll base it off seat after the flag rankings. Even if you have specific questions, feel free to ask them. I'm monitoring the chat. I don't see anything in the Q&A yet. Other resources to check out. Well, I'm on Veterati I was for the reserves. Okay. Yeah, on Veterati, you might find a few reservists who are overseas, but they are rarer. For the reserves, I think your best point of contact is your local retention NCO or retention officer. They should have a view of all job positions overseas. You can also search for U.S. Army Reserve overseas positions on the HRC website for job search. And it's a little tricky, but you can search for it, and your retention NCO or officer should have the same list, and they should be able to know more. But if they aren't a help, you can always reach out to me on VetSec. I know U.S. Army Reserve in particular is transforming their structure in Europe, so many new jobs are opening up. Now that I've had a taste of France, you think you'll move again in the future? the way my life is trending, I'm moving every 3 years. So perhaps I could move again in 3 years. And I happen to live in Paris, France, which I heard is very different from the rest of France. So the move could be to another part of France. It could be to another part of the EU. Might not go back to the US, but never know. Anyways, I'm open to opportunities. Yeah, there's a tour of duty page to search for orders, and Europe is a very active and happening theater for the US military. So there are opportunities, especially if you are willing to take 365 days away from your job. There's also units here where you can drill perhaps quarterly if you don't want to take a big absence from your job. Okay, there's 4 minutes to the next session, so feel free to ask any remaining questions, take a break. I'll hang out till the bottom of the hour.